Good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde. My name is Edward Freeland. I'm the Executive Director of the Survey Research Center at Princeton University. I'm very pleased to have been invited to present at this conference. What I want to show you today is some work focusing on the strength of democratic ideals among those who say they are least satisfied with democracy. In other words, when we look closely at the people throughout Europe who are least satisfied but most committed to democratic ideals, what kind of heterogeneity do we find that might tell us something important about why they are so dissatisfied with democracy? How strongly do they believe in democracy as an ideal toward which their society should strive? Related to that, how open are they to alternative ways of governing? And of course, the main alternative we're most worried about is autocracy, or short of that, single-party rule. What makes this research possible is an important key innovation in round 6 of the European Social Survey that asks about the key components of democracy in a general or ideal or abstract sense, and democracy as it works specifically in each respondent's country. I'm going to refer to these differences as the gaps. So what I'm doing in looking for these dissatisfied democratic idealists draws in part on the measure called satisfaction with democracy, or SWD. In the ESS data, this variable is called STF-DEM, which I'm sure is very familiar to everyone in this audience. This question has been asked on many different surveys, and there's quite a vigorous debate about how to interpret people's answers. It's intended to work as a summary measure of a very complicated concept. When you run the term satisfaction with democracy in quotes on Google Scholar, you get over 11,000 hits. We know there has been a steady long-term decline in SWD in many countries, particularly the US. And the big concern, of course, is how bad things can get before a country's political system starts to fall apart. Our classic theories of how democracy is supposed to work presume some basic level of legitimacy beyond which government cannot function. And here's the distribution of responses for satisfaction with the way democracy works in your country. This is for Europe as a whole, so we're using the analytic weight here and ignoring cross-country differences for the moment, but keeping in mind that those differences are substantial, as we'll see shortly. This distribution is for the round 6 data that were collected in 2012, not long after the financial crisis. 10 years later, in round 10, we get a similar distribution with the center value of 5 as the mode, but a slight shift to the right as countries get through the financial crisis and satisfaction with democracy improves. And here, of course, is the book that describes that initial project in round 6 that set the goal of carefully asking about democracy in an ideal sense and democracy as it applies to or works in your own country. Developing and testing these questions was a difficult undertaking, which is described in detail in Chapter 2. Keep in mind that any philosopher from Richard Rorty to Slavoj Žižek will tell you that having meaningful conversations with everyday ordinary people about a complex concept like democracy is very difficult. And even after you come up with the question wording for these various components of democracy, you then have to translate them into at least 29 different languages for sets of people with different educations and different historical and cultural backgrounds. Here's the format for the 2 sets of questions that ask about the various features of democracy. First in the abstract for democracy in general, and then in the real application for the respondent's home country. We see the prompt in the first set of questions that think about democracy in general, and then the prompt in the second set of questions to think about how much the statement applies to the respondent's own country. This is the list of the main features of democracy, along with the mean score that range from 0 to 10, with 5 as the middle point, a measure of dispersion from the mean, and then the percentage of respondents who gave that particular feature of democracy the highest possible score of 10. Here we see that the courts treat everyone the same gets the highest scores, with a mean of 9.23, and 70% of the respondents giving this element of democracy the maximum score of 10. That's followed by the government explains its decisions to voters with a mean of 8.87. National elections are free and fair, and the courts are able to stop the government from acting beyond its authority. Then at the bottom, the least important features are politicians taking into account the views of other European governments and voters discussing politics with people they know before deciding how to vote. Notice how in this third column, the dispersion of scores around the mean tends to increase as the importance ratings goes down, which is what we would expect to see. Now, what happens when we compare each element of democracy in the abstract to its corresponding reality in the respondent's country? Here we can calculate what I'm calling the gap score, or the simple difference between the ideal and the in-country reality in the opinion of each respondent. Negative values here presumably reflect the degree to which the respondent feels this particular feature of democracy falls short of the ideal. The more negative the gap, the more the country falls short. Note that as we look across these gap scores, the mode is consistently 0, while the means and the medians are always negative, meaning that the ideal is usually rated higher than the reality. Now we can interpret positive values as an indication that the respondent gives less priority to a particular feature of democracy in the abstract, while saying that that feature is characteristic of the way democracy works in his or her country. Free and fair elections, not a big deal in general, but certainly how things are done in my country. A gap score of 0, on the other hand, means that the ideal and the reality are assigned equal importance. But it could also indicate instances where respondents had difficulty thinking about these various features of democracy in an ideal sense, apart from how they are practiced in their home country. Also, keep in mind that this gap score only tells us the size of the gap, but not its location. So a gap between a 10 and a 7 must be substantively different from a gap between a 5 and a 2. Here we see the same list of democratic elements as we saw before, sorted the same way, but this time with the mean gap score for each element. The largest gap is on the 5th item in the list. The government protects all citizens against poverty. The next highest is the item at the top of the list. The courts treat everyone the same. And the item with the 3rd largest gap score is the government takes measures to reduce differences in income levels. Now, what do you notice about these 3 items? They have a common theme, namely equity, legal equity, and social equity. So when it comes to the key feature of democracy that Europeans as a whole believe are most in need of improvement, equity is very important. The 4th largest gap score is related to the issue of transparency, which is one of the key components of trust in government and something I've been studying in another survey project I'm running. I mentioned cross-country variation before, and here you can see for the 3 items I've chosen here, courts treat everyone the same, elections are free and fair, and the government protects all citizens against poverty. We get a very strong sorting with the older established democracies of the Nordic countries coming out on the top with the lowest gap scores, and the newer democracies of Eastern Europe with much higher gap scores at the bottom. In the first column of each table, you see the mean gap score for each country, and here I'm using the PSP weight to get the mean values. And then in the second column, the mean gap scores for just the people who gave that feature of democracy a 10 in the abstract. So you can see their gap scores are consistently higher on average. What about gap sizes for varying degrees of satisfaction with democracy, the variable we saw earlier? Here we take the gap scores for each of the same 3 components of democracy, and we calculate the mean gap size. Notice that for all 3 sets of gap scores, the mean size of the gap decreases with each level of satisfaction with democracy. It seems to be a fairly clean monotonic decline as you go from least to most satisfied. And then you get this slight bump upward for the smallest category of extremely satisfied. Now, I deal with a lot of survey data, and usually much of it is messy because people's opinions and ideologies are messy. So it's rare to see this kind of orderly consistency. It seems to me that if we were looking for a way to validate whether satisfaction with democracy is a good summary measure of how people feel about the way democracy works in their country, these gap scores would be a good way to do it. Let's go back to the task I mentioned earlier, namely looking at the people who are least satisfied with democracy and trying to figure out who they are and what are their reasons for their dissatisfaction. If these people are dissatisfied but hold strong ideals about democracy, then they would seem to be the people who are most likely to support reforms that will bring their country's political systems closer to their ideals. They could potentially serve as a bulwark against populism and autocracy. And here I'm thinking of the notion of critical citizens that Creasy and Saris mention in chapter 10 of the book, and also a group that Russell Dalton refers to in his book, Democratic Challenges, Democratic Choices. Who are these critical citizens? Are they old? Are they young, rich, poor? And importantly, are they politically active? Do they vote? Do they contribute time and effort to organizing political parties? Originally, I thought I was going to use some kind of cluster analysis or principal components analysis to identify this group of satisfied idealists in each country, but I haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. So for the moment, I'm going to start by taking those least satisfied with the way democracy works in their respective countries, and then narrow down to those who give the highest importance ratings to two measures of democratic ideals, namely free and fair elections and the courts treat everyone the same. Within that group, we're going to funnel down to those people who say it is most important for them to live in a democratically governed country. On average, this gets us down to a group that makes up about 14% of the population in each of the 29 countries in the sample. At this point, I'm thinking of this outcome as a 4-category nominal variable formed by 2 categories of idealism and 2 categories of satisfaction with democracy. And that's illustrated here. If I have this right for Europe as a whole, the group I'm calling the dissatisfied idealists make up about 14% of the population, while the satisfied idealists have a nearly equal proportion at 15%. The largest group is what I'll call the dissatisfied non-idealists at 43%, and then the satisfied non-idealists at 28%. In terms of demographics, there doesn't seem to be much to distinguish the dissatisfied idealists from the rest of the adult population for Europe as a whole. They are about the same age as everyone else. They tend to be better educated than the non-idealists, but the satisfied idealists are the best educated of the 4 groups. Not much difference in terms of gender. Women are slightly less idealistic. Then in terms of income, the satisfied idealists have the highest average incomes, which in part reflects their greater levels of education. At this stage, I'm still looking at Europe as a whole, so the more significant differences are likely to emerge when we partition off the variance due to differences between countries. But overall, at this higher aggregate level, there are no demographic differences that seem to stand out. And what about political activity? Here we see the dissatisfied idealists more likely to have voted in the last election than the 2 groups of non-idealists, but they're still less likely than the satisfied idealists to have voted in the most recent national election. That's pretty much the pattern we see for all these political behaviors until we get down to the last one. This shows that the dissatisfied idealists were much more likely than the other 3 groups to have ever participated in a demonstration. The other distinguishing feature of the dissatisfied idealists is that their gap scores are much greater on all aspects of democracy than the other 3 groups. And this is consistent pretty much with the way we've defined these 4 groups. When we compare proportions across countries, this is where we really start to see significant differences. What I've done here is to sort the round 6 countries from the largest to the smallest proportions of dissatisfied idealists. Remember, on average, this was about 14% of the population. In this chart, they are represented by the green bars. On the right side of the blue bars for the proportion of satisfied democratic idealists in each country. The two groups of non-idealists are in lighter gray colors near the center of the bar. The first thing you notice is a country sorting we don't usually see with ESS data, because some of the newer Eastern European democracies show up right alongside the more established Northern, Western, and Southern countries. So right between Sweden and Belgium, both of which have low proportions of dissatisfied idealists, we find Lithuania. At the top of the list, we see several former communist countries such as Albania, Bulgaria, and Kosovo. Right next to them are Spain and Italy, both having relatively large proportions of dissatisfied idealists and small proportions of satisfied idealists. This got me wondering how these differences might arise. And the first thing I thought of was whether there are differences in civics education between these countries. And it turns out that when you Google civics education in Europe, this is what you get. This is the website for the Civics Innovation Hub. This is a project that tracks the numbers, activities, and network connections among civic sector organizations throughout Europe. On this page, we can choose a country to get summary information about that country's civic sector. Let's start with Lithuania. It has 17 organizations that are working on issues of democratization, civil rights, and so on in their country. Now what happens when we look at another Eastern European country near the top of the list I just showed you? We might expect it to have more civics organizations, given that the proportion of dissatisfied democratic idealists is much higher in countries at the top of the list. And here we see that Albania has 52 civics organizations, about 3 times the number that we saw in Lithuania. The same is true for Bulgaria, which has 54 civic organizations. So this pattern might provide some clues as to why some countries have relatively high proportions of dissatisfied democratic idealists and others have low proportions. These organizations may be instrumental in raising people's expectations about how their governments should be performing and what governments are doing to help create greater political and economic equity in those societies. So to sum up, we see from looking at patterns in gap scores that the highest levels of dissatisfaction among Europeans are associated with concerns about equity, both legal and social. And behind these equity issues are concerns about government transparency. Third, I think the gap scores are a good way to validate satisfaction with democracy as a summary measure about how people feel about government performance in their own countries. Fourth, I'm working my way toward identifying the dissatisfied democratic idealists in order to understand whether and how they are or can be a significant driving force for democratic reforms. And we saw that those high gap scores and strong ideals turn up in many of the newest and most fragile democracies in Europe. And finally, I think we need to consider the role of civic organizations, not only as a channel for efforts to reform and strengthen democracy, but also as a factor in raising expectations of how well governments should be performing. Thank you.